Okay, thanks everybody for coming. We're nearly towards the end of this week-long series of events in the Festival of Politics and Applied Global Ethics. I think, from what I've been to at least, have been a great success. I'd be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to plug the event tomorrow. So if you've signed in to the Syria event tomorrow, make sure you're there at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Lecture theatre, anyway, 4th floor. Lecture theatre B, there you go. Tomorrow at 9:30. And make sure you've had a look at the files and the links that I've sent you in advance of that. And if you've got a laptop, smartphone, tablet, bring that along as well. Don't worry if you haven't, that's fine. But if you have, it might just make the day a little bit easier. Okay, the event for the next couple of hours is about progressive alternatives to austerity. It's, what are we now, 2013? We're about 5 years into protracted economic and indeed now social crisis. GDP growth, I don't think, has returned to pre-crisis levels in this country and across much of Europe. We face youth unemployment of around 20% in this country, upwards of 50% in some countries in Europe. All that takes place at the same time as rapid economic growth in East Asia, particularly China, India and elsewhere, and therefore marks a moment of real, or ought to mark a moment of real concern and consideration about the path that we're on. And I think what will unite all today's speakers, I'm sure they've got some different ideas, but what will unite all today's speakers is something of a critique of where we are at in the current situation, and perhaps some suggestions for how we might move out of the current politics of austerity. Okay, so my job really is to very briefly introduce our three speakers. First of all, we have Helen Flynn from Councillor Helen Flynn, councillor in Harrogate, but also a member of the Social Liberal Forum and it's the Federal Policy Committee of the Liberal Democrat Party, and also the Social Liberal Forum Council.
Council member of the Social.
That's what I was searching for. A left of centre organisation in and on the left of the Liberal Democrat Party. She's a critic of some aspects of coalition government policy around education, welfare, student debt, and so on. Stood for election at the last general election for the Liberal Democrats, and I noted having worn a number of hats in the past as well, from an entrepreneur, professional in the publishing industry, and also in the voluntary sector. So a lot of experience to draw on for us. We have Professor Dave Webb, who many of you will know from his long-standing contribution to the intellectual community here at Leeds Met. Retired last summer, but is still an emeritus professor with us, and hopefully many of you will be seeing him in class at various times over the next few years. Dave as well has a long history of Leeds Met, worked here from 1979 to last year. But also a varied career in enterprise, in Bell Laboratories, and I remember the presentation you gave when you were leaving. Worked for the Ministry of Defence, and perhaps most importantly, played a senior role in various peace campaigns and the campaign for nuclear disarmament over a long period of time. And we also have Bill Adams, who is the Secretary of Regional TUC. Again, brings with him a commitment to working for alternatives to austerity, and particularly looking at the contribution that regional disparities might play and the role of the north of England in finding progressive alternatives. Again, wears many hats. An editor of Working USA, an academic journal. He's Northern Economics Futures Commissioner for the IPPR North. Served on the board of Yorkshire Forward. Former lecturer in law. Among other things, has been you can correct me if I'm wrong here, a postman, driver, milkman, council worker. He's inside Legment now. It's amazing what you can find in 10 minutes on the internet. And he's also involved in higher education with a role as deputy chair at UPlan.
Just finished.
Just finished. So I think you'll agree, a nice welcome for our speakers first of all. About 15 minutes to talk, if that's all right, and then we'll collect questions at the end and have some interesting debate.
How do I go to full screen on this?
Oh, sorry, yes, okay.
If
I just
and I just click.
Yeah, just click space, arrows, click.
Right, very good. Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you don't think I'm the enemy, being a Liberal Democrat. There are, we like to think in the Social Liberal Forum that we represent, well, I think it's fair to say we do represent the majority of the grassroots support within the Liberal Democrats, and we are very active at the moment. I thought I'd start by just giving a brief kind of overview of where the Social Liberals stand with respect to the role of the state and how we could be actors in the economic realm that we're talking about today. So here's a quote from my colleague. The role of the state is to make the framework within which markets operate fairer, so that the outcomes people experience are more socially just in the first place, before any need for heavy government intervention arises. Put simply, social liberals believe that a fairer economy with rewards themselves distributed more evenly and according to desert would be a far more efficient economy. And I think that really sums it up. As we just heard, 5 years on, the economy is still not recovered and we're still kind of limping along. There's no growth. In fact, I heard an economist say the other day, I think we're still 4 percentage points down from where we were in 2008. And to imagine being able to recoup that is very difficult, actually. We've still got an economy that's skewed by sector. We're still overly reliant, particularly on financial services, and also by region. So there's big problems. But the alternative to austerity is not unausterity, which I suppose some people might say was what happened during the last Labour administration. So that's what the Social Liberals believe. We believe that we need a root and branch change to the way the economy is run, and particularly looking at things like workplace democracy and changes to corporate governance, fair pay, banking reform, housing, and those are things I'm going to touch on today. I'm about to give you a presentation, and I must admit I am actually not the economics expert from the Social Liberal Forum. I'm the education one. But Pratik has put together this book, which I can really recommend to you, getting from our website, called Plan C. And so I'm going to run through Pratik's presentation that he's put together for me to deliver today. So don't expect me to be a complete expert on everything that's in here, but I pretty much know what Pratik thinks. So why are we in the situation where we've got austerity? It's a Europe-wide response to the crisis of capitalism that began in 2008. And the theory is that it supports big cuts to free up the market and control borrowing costs. And we were very much compared to places like Greece, Spain and Portugal, particularly in the early days, which was really wrong, and we're a very different economy to them. So I think many people believe that the Conservatives were using it as a bit of an ideological quest to reduce the size of the state, and I think that many people within the Social Liberals would probably go along with that. We believe that it was almost always destined to fail. So why has austerity failed? The crisis originated in private finance and had deep roots in an economic imbalance. And so the knock-on effect of that knock-on effect on public finances made budget consolidation necessary. And I would still say, actually, probably the Liberal part of me, that we do need to do something about the deficit. We would always argue it's just about speed, really. We believe that resolving the core causes should have been the priority, and also the priority should have been looking at the crisis in living standards, and that predates the Lehman crisis by decades. The expansionary fiscal contraction wasn't expansionary and didn't contract the deficit by much, and basic Keynesian theory and experience said that that's exactly what would happen. So, in effect, even though we had Osborne's Plan A, we all know that has in fact been abandoned, though they haven't been very upfront about it. There's been a far more relaxed timetable of spending cuts. and we're now, the current coalition government is thinking that we'll be, the spending cuts will continue beyond 2015, and certainly as a local councillor we're seeing that. Everything we're getting through from the Local Government Association would suggest that we'll still be having cuts in local government spending until 2019. So, you know, Plan A definitely hasn't worked, and we can see that. Along with the relaxed timetable of spending cuts, there's been a reliance on massive monetary expansion, which has only really favoured the financial services sector, arguably, and hasn't really done anything about inequality in society. They've got very much a wait-and-see approach. They're almost waiting for the invisible hand to do something. We know there's a lot of money, capital tied up in corporations, but there's a real problem with aggregate demand, and so therefore corporations are holding on to their money, and they're not spending it, and we really believe that the problem at the moment is one of demand. There's been some recognition within the coalition of the importance of investment, and that there has been some capital infrastructure investment, mainly down to Nick Clegg, I would argue. So that's been a good thing about what we've done. They're trumpeting at the moment about a return of growth, but the return to growth that we've seen is imbalanced. Again, most of it is towards the higher earners, and in fact, literally the 1%, and even like the 0.001%, the really rich people are doing extremely well, and probably because of things to do with globalisation. It's not helping people, the majority of people, the vast majority of people. So these claims of growth aren't right. Things like Help to Buy will not help the endemic problems that we see are still there. Living standards have been crushed. People, particularly things like the bedroom tax, have been an absolute nightmare, and we don't believe sustainable. So maybe there has been a bit of growth, but at what cost, and has it really changed anything? So what do we want from the economy? We want balanced budgets. Balanced budgets aren't an end in themselves, and nor is GDP growth. So the social liberal answer is a fair, sustainable economy for all citizens to be able to secure for themselves the capability to live fulfilling lives. And what this means is the end on the reliance on trickle-down of wealth from where it's concentrated in the hands of the few, and addressing the inequitable distribution of power, risk and reward that widens inequality of voice, wealth and income. It's not quick fix. You can't do it in 5 years. It's root and branch reform, and that's basically what Plan C, which I'm going to be talking about now, is all about. So the alternative to austerity is not the opposite, as I said at the beginning, simply spending as before. What we're calling for, what we want to see, is a complete overhaul of political economy that has its roots before the crisis. So the reason why the alternative to austerity must go beyond just counter-cyclical fiscal policy is clear, and particularly in the last 6 months. The growth returns, albeit after years, are just fuelled by the same house price and consumer credit boom as before, and with scarring effects of worklessness in the meantime, and living standards are just stagnating. Without changing the balance of power in the economy, we're returning to business as usual, stagnant real wages, consumer spending based on house price inflation and credit, and rising energy, housing and transport costs, and the dysfunctional banking system. So we have to move beyond Plan B, and here we are, Plan C, which, as I said, is on our website. Written by Pratik Bush, who's one of my colleagues and an economic expert. So Plan C is nearly 2 years old, but we believe it still largely holds true what Pratik wrote then. There's 3 key pillars. It's public investment, where private sector fails, not just counter-cyclically and post hoc, but in sectors with chronic underinvestment, especially housing, green energy and transport. It's part of active industrial strategy. You'll have heard Vince Cable talking more about proper industrial strategy, you know, which is great. We would see the state as a, now I can't pronounce this, a Matsukato, she's a very famous economist apparently, and what she speaks about, which we would agree with, is well, what she talks about, I don't know if any of you have heard of her, is the fact that the state has had a largely unacknowledged risk-taking role through history that's never been properly appreciated, and it should, in theory, have the ability to set the vision and mission for private sector growth, which is very different to the more laissez-faire approach as would be typified by the Conservatives. We would see it being particularly delivered through organisations called public interest corporations, and it being long-term with an arm's length infrastructure investment board. Second pillar would be fair finance that's fit for purpose. So that would involve a re-engineered financial sector with a diversity of provider, with its mutuals, public banks and national investment bank, or a combination of lots of different players, and with regional focus as well, I should add. Getting lending to where it's needed most, away from residential property and into innovative and green business. And then the third pillar would be socially just flexicurity labour market. A living wage is absolutely critical, and there needs to be a new balance between risk and reward, delivered through workplace democracy and reforms to corporate governance. Public, private and mutual institutions should be delivering flexicurity by boosting lifelong skills training, involving friendly societies, delivering sector-wide employment, insurance and a guaranteed minimum income. What Plan C would deliver would vary as the economic landscape shifts, but the values would remain the same, and that's the important thing, which is a fair, sustainable economy for all citizens to be able to secure for themselves the capability to live fulfilling lives, and the fact that the state's role is more than simply plugging gaps in the otherwise imperfect market, balancing their own books, and more about framing political economy to meet the needs of today and tomorrow. So that's some kind of contact details there at the end. So that's Pratik's presentation, and I hope that's given you an overview of what a social liberal approach would be to an alternatives to austerity. There's a few more points I'd like to make as a local councillor and a politician in general. My own observation would be, I think a lot of the current crisis, and not just the current crisis, but Labour administration before it, and before that, actually stems from a crisis in leadership at a local and a national level, and I think we're seeing this being reflected now in things like the Occupy movement, Russell Brand's recent proclamations. There's a real problem with politics, and I think that the real problem with politics actually stems from the people who are doing politics. We haven't got the kind of level of leadership that we need to be able to have a vision that people can buy into and believe in and go along with. We've got a group of career politicians in control, and have done for some time, who have no feel for what life is like for the vast majority of people in this country. Now, locally, I know as a councillor that locally we could be doing a lot more, but we just simply don't have the power to do it. I think it's now the case that we're the most centralised country in the whole of Europe, which I find is shocking, and I'm very disappointed as a Liberal Democrat, who is the party of devolution, that we haven't been able to achieve more in terms of local democracy in the coalition government. So we do need greater autonomy at a local level, because that will help us with things like housing. If we could relax the borrowing rules that currently exist, we could build more houses locally. It's a great way of providing money. It's a great way of local economies becoming self-sufficient through having social housing, and also through things like local income tax and being able to retain the business rates ourselves, which would be the vast majority of the business rates ourselves, which would be a great help. So I think there's a lot we could be doing more at a local level, and that's really urgent in this part of the country, because where we're saying that wealth's concentrated right at the top, it's also concentrated in the southeast of the country as well. So we've really got to try and do something about the regions and local democracy in general. At the moment, I think the other thing we need to do nationally, crisis leadership I've talked about, but we also have to look about whether politics and the way politics works is actually helping us. Ideology, talked about that during the presentation. I believe the Tories are very focused on shrinking the state, and that's behind a lot of what they're doing, and we see that in education as well, in terms of the academies and free schools, which are now basically private companies. So ideology, does that really help us? The laissez-faire approach to the market, does that really help us? Arguably not. There's a crisis of trust in politicians, and there's also, allied to this, there's falling membership in political parties. The Tories, I think when Margaret Thatcher came in, had a membership of something like 3 million. I now know that their membership is under 100,000. We must begin at some point to question the legitimacy of political parties which have such small numbers of the population actually actively involved in them. So how can we move towards sensible and sustainable policies? Well, it obviously requires more consensus, and in that way I actually agree with the coalition. I think coalition is a good thing, because that's how decisions are made. You make decisions through consensus. And the Finnish model in education, which some of you are probably not aware of, has succeeded. They are the top performing education country in the world. And the reason why, quite simple, at roots in the late 1960s, they all sat down and they said, things aren't working, we've got to work together, all the political parties, and they've left it alone. They've left education alone, and they've let it develop, and there's always been consensus, and that's the single reason, I would argue, why the Finnish education system is the most highly effective in the world. My final word is just about social mobility. I've talked about the widening gap and growth being at the top. My belief has always been that social mobility is the wrong model, and we've got to throw it out. Vince Cable came up with a very good example, saying that no, well, you know, he's from Hull. He said, well, we haven't got a high court judge in Hull, and it was a big thing, we haven't got a high court judge. But say if you did have a high court judge in Hull, you'd still have, you know, tens of thousands of people really poor. What does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. What we have to address is not a ladder of social mobility, because that's not meaningful, and it's not true. It's actually a pyramid. It's 3D, and there's a tiny few people at the top and loads and millions down at the bottom. It doesn't work. We have to try and get rid of that model and move to a more kind of social, democratic, flatter, donut-shaped structure where everyone can lead a fulfilling life. So, as I say, basically, in order to get sustainable policies that will help us address the current economic crisis and move away from austerity, we have to think about really seismically shifting the whole of the way we operate in our political economy. Thank you.
I'm sure many of you got some interesting questions to ask. Hold on to those for a minute. We'll listen to Dave and to Bill first, and then, by all means, ask them. So, do you want your video first? Or?
No. Thank you. This is really scary because I don't know anything about economics, and I guess this is what it's mostly about. But I would like to offer an alternative. And my alternative would be to demilitarize society. I almost said dematerialize, but
That might be a good idea.
that might be a good idea as well. You know. Right. So. Economics isn't my thing. I don't understand it. It's far too complicated. I'm just a physicist, or I was a physicist at one time. Physics is fine by me, but economics, much too difficult. So I had to look up what austerity was even really, or what the definition might be in Wikipedia, which we're not supposed to use, I know. So ignore that. But it gave you something that could be quite useful. So it says in economics, austerity describes policies used by governments to reduce budget deficits during adverse economic conditions. These policies may include spending cuts, tax increases, or a mixture of the two. Austerity policies may be attempts to demonstrate government's liquidity to their creditors and credit rating agencies by bringing fiscal incomes closer to the expenditure. So basically, we all know what the effects of cuts are, I'm sure. We're well aware of some of the statistics that have come out, some of the effects it's having on people. Usually the poorest members of society, or always the poorest members of society, who can least afford to do without. And it's basically to pay for the huge deficit that we have between what we earn and what we spend. And mainly, I think, what I understand is that we owe loads of money, we have a huge debt, but in the past we have been able to kind of bluff our way through it. I think America has an enormous debt. I don't quite understand. See, this is what I don't understand. How does that work? It's ridiculous. And yet they've been able to carry on for years with this huge debt. And it's basically based on faith. People will think somehow or other in the end it will work out. See, physics isn't like that. You know, we have models that work or don't work, and we change the things if it doesn't work. We try and find a better model. In economics, it just never seems to work to me. Anyway, sorry. Let's move on. How do I move on? Oh. So.
Not that long ago, Dave.
So, what does it mean to people, austerity? It means that the poorest suffer. It means that at the moment we're seeing the richest are encouraged to carry on as normal, keep doing the same things, make more money in order for that to trickle down, which it never does, of course, as we know. So the rich get richer, the poor suffer. There are also demons that are kind of brought up to bear, to blame for the problems that we're in. Maybe they're bankers sometimes, and I'm sure actually bankers are demons, so maybe that's justified. But there's other things like immigrants, welfare dependence, sucking the country dry, etc., etc. And these things then are encouraged, we are encouraged to believe these things, and not more than encouraged, we're almost told that this is the truth. And then there are factors, these factors together then, what they do is they encourage what in the peace movement or in peace studies we would call structural violence. I don't know if there are any peace studies people here, but if you are, you'll know that we talk about three types of violence. There's direct violence, which is when people start hitting each other. There's structural violence, which is caused by the injustices and the things that aren't quite right about a society. So if there are people that are incredibly poor and people that are incredibly rich, that's an injustice, and that's a kind of violence. It's a violence of the rich over the poor, and people who have and people who have not. Then there's another form of violence, which is cultural violence, and that is the ways in which your culture will accept the use of violence to solve problems. So it accepts warfare as a valid way of going about solving international relations problems, etc., etc. And we don't, I think this is an interesting and a useful analysis to try to analyse the way that we behave sometimes in society, or even as a human being, an individual. So these things, austerity will cause more injustice and more unrest. And that will cause more problems within society. And I think my kind of, what I'd like us to think about is how we might change. We don't just need to change economics, I think. We need to restructure society. We need to rethink the way our society works or doesn't work. Oops. So I want to talk a little bit about this thing called a Global Peace Index. It's something that's been put together by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and they've included measures of what's known as positive peace as well as negative peace. And again, you might not know the difference between those things. Negative peace is being defined as just like the absence of war. It doesn't mean to say just because there isn't a war that you are in a peaceful society. It just means there isn't a war going on at that particular time. So a negative peace would be just an absence of war. A positive peace would be more towards working towards a peaceful society constructively and positively. So these indicators, and I wouldn't trust indicators because they are only indicators. They're not anything other than that, and they're only indicators based on these particular aspects that this group has put together. But they have got 22 indicators to try and measure ways in which the various countries around the world are acting in a positive or negative, peaceful way. So I won't go through all of those indicators. You can look up on the website, Global Peace Index, if you want to know what those are. So here, as it says, the levels of perceived criminality, for example, the number of police per 100,000 people, and the level of organised crime are all included in these indicators. And external peace indicators as well, including the military expenditure as a percentage of gross domestic product and nuclear weapons capabilities. So this little peace index has been going on for a few years now. I'd just like to show you this short film that they've made. It's just a few minutes. So I don't know if this is going to work. Should do, shouldn't it?
It's there in the background.
Okay, maybe I should do that.
The world has become less peaceful this year. Levels of global peace have fallen by 5% since 2008, and the nature of global conflict is shifting. The 2013 Global Peace Index shows that while there's been a decline in hostility between states, the number and intensity of internal conflicts is increasing. In a period characterised by violent hangovers from the Arab Spring, deterioration in Afghanistan and Pakistan, civil war in Syria, escalation of the drug war in Central America, and violent anti-austerity protests across Europe, the trend towards violence was experienced by 110 nations over the past 6 years. Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, and Sudan foot the table in the 2013 index. But the lack of peace doesn't just affect areas in conflict. It impacts everyone, as it takes a heavy toll on the global economy. The Global Peace Index shows that in 2012, violence cost $9.46 trillion US. That's 11% of gross world product, almost double the world's agricultural production and 75 times more than the official development assistance provided to countries in need last year. Despite the overall decline in global peace, many nations have shown resilience to the recent violent trend. Iceland, Denmark and New Zealand are regular features at the top of the table, with small and stable democracies dominating the top 10 most peaceful countries. Interestingly, recoveries from national grievances in Chad, Haiti and Georgia have seen large increases in peace scores for all 3 countries. This is not only a direct result of decreased levels of civil unrest, it is also a concerted effort to improve the structures and institutions that move societies away from violence towards peace. The data shows that peace is not just about the absence of violence. It is about the lasting development of societies and the well-being of citizens. The results for the 2013 GPI signal a need for a greater focus on peace as a prerequisite for growth and prosperity. If we choose to make peace our measuring stick for success, we can apply the resources necessary to attain it.
So basically, we might be asking the wrong questions. We might be measuring the wrong things. That's what I would also suggest, that we need other forms of measurement than just an economic one. In the UK, we figure in this Global Peace Index to be 44 out of 162. We're a pretty militaristic society. Our society and security is reasonably okay, I guess, but we don't have too much domestic and internal conflict. But we are a militaristic society, And as the index, or that little short film said, it's not just the people who are in conflict that are affected by their conflict. It's really the whole world. The Peace Index even goes to look at regions within the UK to see how peaceful or non-peaceful they are. You can see Yorkshire actually seems to be a more peaceful place, you'll be pleased to know. So, good place to be. But overall, I'd just like to also mention something about military spending. The UK's military budget is around £38 billion. It's the fourth largest in the world, and we're not the fourth largest country by any means. So this is a huge amount of money and takes money away from public services. As you know, there have been cuts in public services all over in the last few years. But there hasn't been much. There has been a bit of a cut in defence spending, but nowhere near as much as in some of the other more beneficial ways of spending money. So education, health and social services are being cut dramatically, but not so much with defence. Also, the UK exports arms, and according to SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, their database, the UK was the sixth largest exporter, arms exporter, between 2008-2012, which accounts for about 4% of world deliveries. And we're not too fussy about who we send our arms to either. We sell them to anybody. There are supposedly rules and regulations about who we sell them to, but those rules and regulations are bypassed quite regularly. If you have a look at the Campaign Against the Arms Trade website, you'll see that there are violations of those kind of so-called rules over and over. So we export arms to dodgy regimes who use them against their citizens, and then sometimes we even have to go and invade those, or we say, we're told we have to go and invade those regimes that we've sold arms to just a few years before. These are the value of the UK arms exports around the world, and you can see where the focus is, not surprisingly, around the Middle East area and North Africa. So it's a big business, it's a huge business, and we're not the only ones involved in it, of course. Not only do we export arms, we import arms, and the UK was the 14th largest arms importer during 2008 to 2012, and previous to that, 2003 to 2007. But the volume of imports increased by 18% between those two periods. The US supplied 70% of the British arms imports, and other EU members another 27%. Missiles were accounting for 41% of the volume of British imports. So, one other thing that's worth noting is the war in Afghanistan. This has cost Britain around £37 billion, equivalent to more than £2,000 for every tax-paying household in the country. Since 2006, it's cost something like £15 million a day to maintain Britain's military presence in Helmand province. This is the equivalent of £25,000, which will have been spent for every one of Helmand's 1.5 million inhabitants. What are we doing there? Why are we doing that? By 2020, Britain will have spent at least £40 billion on its Afghan campaign, enough to recruit over 5,000 nurses and pay for them throughout their careers. It could also fund free tuition for all students in British higher education for 10 years. These are some of the figures that have been quoted in a book called Investment in Blood by Frank Ledwidge, which has just been published just recently. Also mention nuclear weapons, because this is a particular interest of mine, concern of mine, I suppose. Nuclear weapons numbers, many people don't even realise that nuclear weapons are still a problem in the world. They don't even realise that the UK has nuclear weapons, but we do. In fact, we're something like the fourth or fifth largest nuclear weapons holder in the world. There are thousands of nuclear weapons around the world. Some of them, many of them, ready to be launched at a moment's notice. Something like 17,000 or more warheads globally, mostly in Russia and the United States. This has come down quite dramatically from a much larger 69,000 in 1985, but it still represents some 420,000 times the combined power of the bombs that were dropped, the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. And it's easily enough to destroy the whole planet several times over. Some 4,000 of those nuclear devices are on hair trigger alert, ready to be fired at very short notice, including 100 or so that are in the British Trident submarines, floating somewhere around the oceans of the world every day, every minute of every day. And these are costly weapons. It's estimated, these are estimates for 2011, because nobody really has the full figures for these things. They're not released generally, but something like, for the UK you'll see on this table, it costs something like around $5.5 that's billion pounds, dollars, US dollars a year to maintain that weapon system, nuclear weapons alone. And this is a picture of the UK Trident submarine. Nowadays, the UK's, all of its nuclear weapons are on submarines, and this is one of them. They're huge submarines built by Vickers in the UK, but the missiles themselves, the missiles are actually American, and we rent those from the United States. The warheads are British, made at Aldermaston and Burfield, but again, they're based on US designs. And the submarine is also based on US design. We have 4 submarines based in Faslane in Scotland. Each of those carries 8 Trident missiles, and each missile has an average of 5 100-kiloton warheads. Each of those warheads has the destructive power of 7 times the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and killed tens of thousands of people. And it has a cost. The original cost of Trident was some £12.5 billion. The annual running cost is something like £1.5 billion, and its refit at Devonport costs almost £1 billion in Plymouth every few years. There's also a cost in terms of other aspects of nuclear weapons. For example, I don't know whether you realise, but the warheads have to travel from Scotland back and forth from Scotland to Aldermaston or Burfield, where they're put together, and these happen in convoys. These convoys come up and down the country. They come up the A1, they come very close to Leeds, in fact. Not many people realise that these convoys are around. They're huge trucks. That truck on the top right-hand side there is a relatively new model, but they cost £1 million each to produce. They're armoured. They're large convoys because they carry fire trucks, nuclear dispersion systems in case of an accident, and there have been accidents, and also marines to protect the convoy, because these are nuclear warheads that are going up and down the country quite regularly. So there are plans for Trident replacement that some of you may or may not know about. The decision to make on whether to replace Trident will be made after the next general election. Now, estimates, the government tells us, all governments have told us, Labour and Tories, that it will cost something like £20 billion to replace Trident. But that's only part of the cost, in fact. The initial costs are likely to be something like 30 billion, and of course these escalate all the time. None of these costs are low, turn out to be lower than they estimated. They always turn out to be sometimes double. But there's also other costs, including the equipment and buildings at Aldermaston, the developments there, and the cost of the convoys, the cost of all the other things that run to go with nuclear weapons. So altogether, it's estimated that the cost will be something like £100 billion. Now, the reason I bring this up is because at the time of austerity, why are we spending, or why are we even thinking of spending £100 billion on renewing a nuclear weapon system that nobody really understands why we have it, or why, or under what circumstances we would actually use it. And this is why I think one of the things we have to really consider very carefully, this is just one example, of course, nuclear weapons are just one example of the militaristic ways in which our society thinks and accepts these things as being necessary. So my radical suggestion for an alternative to austerity is to actually cut nuclear weapons altogether and rethink the way in which we're organising ourselves as a society. We need to demilitarise our society. We need radical change. We need to have sustainable processes and procedures which are sustainable, truly sustainable, not based on growth. We need to demilitarise, we need to cooperate with others and between ourselves rather than compete. We can do a lot more together than we can if we're fighting each other or competing with each other. And we should become more human-centred rather than state or system-centred, if you see what I mean. So we need to focus on what human needs are, not what the needs of the system or the processes or procedures that are there that we put together so we can change them in order to build the society that we want. I think I'll say no more than that, really. I think I've said my piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Bill, do you want to use a...
Thanks, Darren. Thanks for the invite. It's always useful to have a stage for trade union views, given our current state of affairs, where we get very little coverage on the national media. Evident only the last few weeks when we had 70,000 people marching against austerity in Manchester at the Tory party conference. Not one mention on the evening news. And I believe that nothing was mentioned at all about People's Assembly events which were happening all over the country on bonfire night. Again, nothing at all, very, very little coverage. So it's always good to have an invite. Thanks to Paul and the department for letting me come along. I've got to say that I'm not an academic, although I've been to university. I'm not an economist, but I have been around the workplace a long time. Someone described me only this morning as a TUC grandee. I'm not sure what that means. I think it just means I'm an old git. But they wanted me on the radio to talk about the living wage. Basically, I was school at 16, uninterested really in any kind of qualifications. I've got a number of O levels. A number of people in the audience will remember that one. But I've had loads of jobs. I've run my own small business. I've been to university. Although as a mature student, I don't think I got the full enjoyment out of what university and higher education holds for most of you. But it didn't cost me anything. I've been bleeped out. But basically, you know, these past few years, since the financial crash, has caused a recession like we've never had really since the 1930s. And I'm not that old, but I remember that. But I do remember previous recessions in the 80s and the 90s. And this has a feel of being much more severe and much more deep in its content. And it's been the longest kind of drawn out period of fall in living standards since the last century. And basically, you know, we've got to say what we think has caused it. It was caused by the pursuit of wealth. It was caused by obscene greed by a few people at the top of the banking and finance industry. And it was based on issuing credit, and the inflation of mainly houses in terms of their price, and when people were receiving these huge loans as against incomes, they found out they couldn't pay it back, and hence the confidence crisis and the necessity of the government to step in and bail out the banks. I didn't argue against bailing out the banks at the time because I thought the alternatives to that would have been unpalatable to the vast majority of people in the world, particularly in Britain. And the whole thing, I think, been brought about by a change seen in the early 80s. I was telling Dave, I was watching a programme the other night about the coal industry and how it was nationalised in 1947, and the development of those communities from that nationalisation and the partnership between the coal board and the miners' unions really improved people's lives. You know, they went from living in hovels with hardly anything to eat to having well-skilled, safe, good jobs, well-paid jobs, and a real effort to improve communities' health in those communities and education. The miners built libraries, they built swimming pools, they built holiday camps for the people so they could go and rest. And things were progressing until about 1980, when we got a real change in terms of neoliberal economics. And from then on, the kind of measurement of pay against productivity has started to widen. And we're something like 30% in real terms since 1980. A gap has appeared between growth in productivity and wages of people at the bottom end and in the middle section of the workforce. So wages falling about 30% in real terms, whole swathes of public assets, things that we owned as taxpayers, hived off to private interests, and employment rights weakened right across the board. Trade unions demonised. Everywhere you look, it's trade unions that are a problem. They're the cause of all society's ills. I've even had managers say to me in my previous jobs, I don't like talking to you because I think you've crawled out from under a stove. I took that as a compliment, but anyway, that's how difficult it is for trade unions operating in today's industry, and that's not everywhere, but it certainly is in the majority. And what we've seen is in 1980, something like 73 to 76% of the workforce were covered by collective agreements. We're now down to 23% of the workforce covered by collective agreements, which means there's millions of people who don't have any recognition at work in terms of their bargaining power against the employer. On top of that, we've seen massive tax evasion and avoidance on a scale that's led to public spending cuts that we've never witnessed before, the rolling back of the state, which Helen mentioned, and its responsibilities to its citizens. You know, you only need to look at the question of university fees, for example. I went for nothing. You know, I had mine paid by the taxpayer, and I've done marginally better than I would have done had I not gone to university and had that
You've done a lot better. You've done a lot better.
I always say that, you know, before I went to university, I used to get up at 6 o'clock, 6 days a week to go to work. And after I graduated from university, I only get up at 6 o'clock 5 days a week to go to work. So there is an incentive for
like
that.
25%
Exactly.
Exactly.
And the depression of wages, you know, all that money that, you know, I was privy to in terms of paying my fees has now been transferred onto you, the students in the audience and the individuals who are paying for that for years on end, leaving university with debts, I'm told, 40 to 50,000. That's before you think about any professional qualifications you may want to take later on. So, you know, and on top of that, very difficult to get any job that pays you any kind of decent salary. So the depression of wages and the reduction in trade union power has allowed companies and organisations to massively increase profit levels, many of which end up in tax havens. In fact, I went to a lecture in York this week by Richard Murphy. He's a well established accountant, but he's kind of a critic of the present system. He reported that an average of £75 billion was recycled through tax havens last year. About the same amount of money of which wages have fallen year on year in real terms. So we know where the money's going. And it's not only happened in the UK, but in the US and in some European countries as well, where austerity is now the main plan towards recovery. How will that ever work if people don't have any money to spend to generate the economy? I've talked to businesses all over Yorkshire in recent years. They're dying to invest, but they don't because there isn't the demand. Again, mentioned by my colleague Helen. So reducing people's incomes will never promote any confidence in investment when there's a total lack of demand. And coupling that with the huge reductions in available credit to small businesses and individuals, it's no wonder there's no growth. And even where there is growth, it ain't affecting me. And if it's not affecting me, it's not affecting people on the council estates in Leeds and other areas of Yorkshire and Humber who are reliant, many of them now, on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and going along and trying to get some food from a food bank to the kids, or they're not able, or they're buying they're doing school uniform swaps on the estates in Middleton, just down the road, to survive. That's how, or that's what austerity has caused in this country. And, you know, the fact that the government, which unfortunately has contained some of Helen's party, has had the audacity and the cheek to attack the people right at the bottom end, the most vulnerable in our society, the disabled, people of ethnic minorities, all overwhelmingly, you know, prioritised in terms of how it's affected them, whilst the top 1% have increased their wealth over the period of austerity by £120 billion. I haven't got the reference because I'm not an academic, but that's what I've read and that's what people have told me. And so what can the TUC do, or the trade union movement do, about austerity? Well, it is our central campaign priority. We've made it our business to attack the government on every single issue. And yes, we agree that in some ways there was a need for retrenchment of the public sector account. There is a real issue in terms of welfare, in terms of getting people back to work. If you look at the establishment of the welfare state, it was never meant to be a lifelong option. It was meant to help people through particularly difficult times. And why not invest money into work schemes and people getting proper jobs and training, rather than paying them to stay at home and do nothing but watch Jeremy Kyle all day on TV. So we continue to resist cuts, we continue to fight wage freezes, and we continue to fight for decent jobs, particularly for young people, and investment in skills. One of the ways we can do that is arguing for a fair tax. The figures are almost daily bandied about, how much is going to the Cayman Islands, Guernsey and Gibraltar, all mainly British protectorates, I've got to say, that these people are actually basing themselves in and avoiding paying tax to the Exchequer. There's a simple way of making people pay tax, as if you do business in this country, you pay tax to the British Exchequer at a rate agreed by the democratic government. And all those kind of arguments about, you know, it being tax efficient could easily be levelled flat by a proper, no-nonsense, transparent policy. If you earn money, you pay that rate of tax. And that's not saying that we need to tax people at 98%, but it's about being fair in terms of having the tax available to the Exchequer to make society better. I don't think anybody in this audience would disagree with that. So in that case, you know, if we're able to do that, it makes the people who actually caused the crash make reparations for what they've done. And it also will protect the citizens whose services are being cut as the economy slowed down. And Britain's unions, basically, they're the backbone of the anti-austerity campaign. We're the only group, really, that can build a mass political movement for change, and change there has to be. We can't, as other colleagues have already said, revert back to business as usual. It's a recipe for disaster. It's already collapsed, almost. Some would say that Gordon Brown saved the day. I'm not sure about that one, but certainly he had a hand in rescuing the banks. And it's not good enough to say we'll cut slower or have a little more investment. We've got to actually change the way we do business in order to put people first and have a prolonged living standards increase for those at the bottom end and the middle of the income strategy. We need a new model for economic growth that's sustainable and fair. And that is why our resistance to government policies goes together with a lot of research which we've been doing and thinking that we can build a new economy, a resurgence in manufacturing and the creation of good jobs, not the kind of jobs on offer at the moment at £6 an hour or less. And also, I want to just mention a little bit about the North-South divide. It's kind of well recognised that the South is very much richer than the North, but it's in fact it's a bit more complicated than that. We have places in the North that are very, very wealthy, and we have places in London, for example. 10 of the London boroughs are in the top 20 most deprived areas in the country, and there's places on the South Coast that have extreme difficulties with poverty. So we want to work together, we want to build alliances with grassroots campaigners, like the People's Assembly. There's all kinds of groups out there, UK Uncut, 38 Degrees, all doing lots of things to raise people's awareness about what's going on, because, you know, I've got to say, it's not an attack on Helen, but the government have been very, very good at getting the message across about the deficit. They must have numerous PhDs in language, because they're very, very cute at telling people. I hear people in my pub back at home saying there's no alternative, Bill. There is no alternative. You know, and that's because they've been told a very good story by some very, very clever people who have convinced the country there's no alternative. We've had deficits before. After the Second World War, we made massive social and industrial gains with a deficit. I don't know how many times bigger, but certainly 2.5 times bigger than we have now. And you know, we have millions of houses built. We got people back into jobs. We had social movement of people. We have more people going to education. We have better health with the establishment of the National Health Service. And all that's being ripped up now by a government which is ideologically against any kind of state help for anybody. So we've faced these long-term economic problems. We've got political leaders who failed miserably, and that's right across the parties, to face up to them. The economy's not growing. If it is, I don't see where it is. Incomes are falling, at best not rising, and there are very few new good jobs on offer. It's unacceptable. We need policies that promote new and old industries. And that might sound a little trade unionist, old industries. Let me give you an example. The car industry, the automobile industry was on its knees in the 70s and the 80s. Unions have worked cooperatively with employers and with government. We've now got the most successful car industry in the world, producing exports all over the place. So there is a way of building up old industries and promoting the new, particularly green industries, that's going to move the economy on. These kinds of policies would encourage companies to raise pay, penalise big bonuses, and invest in training. And rather than cutting spending, we need to make sure we reverse this line and have an economy that works for everybody in Britain, not just the people at the top. So what would we do, the TUC? Well, we're arguing for an effective industrial policy, something I think we're not too far away from the Liberal Social Council. Certainly Vince Cable has made some encouraging remarks. I'm not sure how much sway he has in his department anymore, but he certainly isn't far away from what we'd be seeking. Not just for manufacturing, but for all sectors. You know, housing, for example. We're in massive need of housing. I went on a website the other day looking at rental properties in Leeds and an old terrace property in Headingley now. Something like £1,800 a month because it's multi-occupancy. There's thousands of people living in multi-occupied houses. Something we haven't seen really since before the war. We need banks that work for Britain, already mentioned. A state investment bank, a proper green bank, and we need to guarantee that we're working towards full employment, in particular employment for young people with a pathway to give those people hope for the future. And I was just mentioning today, you know, times were hard in the 40s and 50s, so I'm told. But people had hope. My mum and dad used to say to me, when we got married, we had nothing, but we had hope for the future. And people haven't got that anymore. Working towards a green economy that uses the transition to low carbon economy to create jobs, renewable energy, offshore wind, tidal energy, which lasts forever once it's built, and clean coal technology. We're still walking on millions of tons of coal, which were closed down by previous governments. And that we now got the technology to make that work without harming the environment. And we need an effective and fair tax system that tackles the dodgers and makes those who created the crash pay the share, including the Robin Hood tax. 0.05 tax on share transactions would raise, it's been estimated, around about £30 billion a year. And what we need to do is, you know, we need to take action against the tax havens and actually have accountants that help businesses grow. That's their job. Instead of being concentrating on avoiding tax. You go to most accountants and say, I'll get your tax bill down. They don't tell you how to improve your business. They say, I'll get your tax bill down. And we need a proper skills system that works for all. We need stronger vocational and apprenticeship training for our young people who haven't got the ambition or the intellect to go on to an academic career. And how's that going to happen? We're going to have a stronger civil society, and that means stronger unions. It means more of a say at work, and it means being able to protect people through collective and individual rights. The last Labour government brought in lots of individual rights, but they didn't really protect collective rights, and that has led to people, you know, a massive increase in people going to tribunals on an individual basis to try and sort out their employer with a problem at work. And that has just been kind of knocked off overnight by the introduction of £1,000 or £1,200 to take a case to court just to get some justice. And you know, so individual rights are easy to knock off, where collective ones stay the course. We need fair pay, we need a living wage. I've just been on the radio talking about living wage. We introduced the living wage into Yorkshire number. The taxman would earn an extra £2.3 billion in extra revenue every year. And it would also save £1.5 billion in tax credits paid out to workers by us, the taxpayers, in benefits because they don't earn enough from their employers. A lot of employers can pay it. And I'd say this to the government: if the employers can't afford the living wage, then open up the books and let the government help them pay the living wage, instead of every individual being subject to getting dragged down to the DWP and asked how much they've got in the bank before they can get a tax credit. So we're building this nationwide campaign. It's having its effect as well. We're attacking excess city bonuses, which everybody thinks are obscene. You know, the guy from Centrica, British Gas as we know it, turned down his bonus this year of 2.5 million. I didn't see any journalist asking him what his wages actually were. You know, so let's get things right, and let's see what the super rich and the big firms are up to. And we want better pay, and we want to restructure the negotiating environment. Promoting collective bargaining, however you want to call it, new modernised wages councils, industrial democracy, workers on remuneration committees in private sector places, and better state and workplace pensions. It's all affordable if we can get the distribution of money right. On top of that, what we're doing, we're opposing casualisation and outsourcing of workers. Many workers are transferred several times to different employers in a matter of 12 months. 0 hours contracts, where people are sat on the settee at home waiting for a call to see if they can get 2 or 3 hours work in a day. And you know, and I know, if they turn it down, they won't be asked again. million people actually on 0 hours contracts, many of them on the minimum wage. Another arm of our campaign is good service and decent welfare. And unions never want people sat at home on welfare. What we need is good jobs for people to go to. There needs to be a support system if people fall ill or are disabled or unable to work. But what we need is a good system that doesn't demonise people who are on benefit as scroungers as against strivers. Many people who are on benefits are actually in work on low pay or on hours where they need more, on a reduced number of hours. So we've got to explore the myths of all this about who is the demon here and who is taking money from the state. And because we defend and value public services, we want to see them provide the best possible service. And we need to work with user groups on how best to reform public services, not through hiving them off as some cheaper, substandard service that we can offer to our people, but in a way to make them better for the citizens. And last but not least, about respect and a voice at work. Rights are under attack all the time. They've been under attack for as long as I've been at work, I think. And while we've seen off the wildest proposals of the Beechcroft proposal, the Beecroft, the man who owns Wandra, by the way, and even helped on some advances on family-friendly rights, they're going backwards. Rights at work are going backwards. Fees for employment tribunals against unfair dismissal and redundancy, virtually halved the number of cases. The Prime Minister threatened to bring us out of Europe because of the social agreements which we have around working time and holidays, and threatening that we should leave the EU if they don't back down and give us those rights back so we can abolish them. Inequality lays behind this crash. Strengthening workers' voice is key in securing a productive and fair economy, and we want employee reps to have those better rights, strengthened rights in a stronger civil society which can make a case for a more just and prosperous society. If I can persuade any of you, and I'll finish on this, persuade any of you to join us in this campaign, give a thought to leaving a world behind where your kids are going to be better off than you are. I had that hope when I first started work. My sons and daughters don't have that at the moment. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much to all our speakers. We've got a little bit of time left for questions, so could I take perhaps a couple of questions from the audience and let the panel respond? Yes, you first of all.
I'd like to ask people, you talked about a lack of leadership amongst the politicians, but I'd just like to ask you, in view of the fact that corporations and big business put so much money into supporting their political parties, how can that be addressed? I mean, the power of the companies is now so great that that's what's determining what's happening in Britain, and how can that be overcome?
Well,
Okay.
I could
Can we just take one more question, then we'll let everybody respond. So you had a question at the back?
Yeah, I guess it sort of follows on from that. Why is it that there is this absence of hope? You know, is it because it's just a case of the politicians? You've just got a bad group of politicians who don't have the answers, or is there a deeper underlying problem here? You know, because it doesn't seem to be. It's not just politicians. You know, you come to university presumably to sort of learn about the world, and you know maybe you think the universities might have some solutions to the problems of the world. But I fear that people are going to come away disappointed because there doesn't seem to be any solutions in the university as well. And you know, the universities are really the minds of society. I think there might be a deeper underlying problem.
And we had one more question here, and then we'll let the panel respond.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the themes of all the speakers, it was mentioned briefly by, I think, Helen, but I think the biggest problem that we've got in certainly our society is probably the lack of accountability, whether it's politicians, whether it's the constant rewriting of history by the media, which, you know, is constantly influencing people's opinions and telling people there's no alternative, etc., etc. You know, I think we need to really be talking about how do we hold businesses accountable, how do we hold politicians accountable, and how do we hold the media accountable, because they're the people that are in, well, I say informing public opinion. So I'd ask the panel if they've got any suggestions
Okay, so
around that.
3 similar questions. Power of big business, hope, accountability.
Well, I can, well, we can all of that, but I think on the political party, how we fund them, there's a very radical proposal, I think, is a very simple solution, which is basically you give everyone who's entitled to vote £1, and they can put that £1 to whichever political party they want to, and that is the money that the political party has to spend. Now people say, oh well, if you did that, then they might end up, you know, giving it to UKIP or you know, the BNP or whatever. Well, yeah. So deal with that, you know, because I think that the problem is so deep now with people's faith in political parties that there's going to be something's going to happen, and like I said, the decline in membership as well. So the idea of just within the system, you give £1 to every member of the population, and they put that, you know, the Democrats, Tories, Labour, whoever they want to, and it creates a level playing field in terms of, well, not level, because some people get more pounds than another, and it doesn't mean that one party couldn't still win an election if they had less money but good candidates. But you're right, you've got to say, I mean, you know, Liberal Democrats, actually, we don't get much funding for it. We're extremely poor. But you've got the problem with the Tories and the Labour Party, where they're effectively funded by vested interests. The unions for Labour and big business for Tories, and that's just not sustainable, and it does, you know, lead to a lot of cynicism amongst the population. So that's one proposal. I think that the problem with the absence of hope and lack of accountability, I think this all stems from the failure in the neoliberal approach. I think that neoliberalism, though it sounds lovely, doesn't work, you know, because the great thing about liberalism, classic liberalism, is that basically what it says is that you're free to do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anyone. And the problem with neoliberalism is it's forgotten about the hurt. So to go back to a true classical liberal approach, I think, is helpful. And the neoliberal kind of bread and circuses for the lower people and you know, lots of money, and with globalisation the ability to make even more money for the top 0.001% is just not a recipe for success, and it leads to this lack of hope. So I think we have to rethink neoliberalism completely and go back to more sustainable approaches with more equal, you know, reducing the gap, the donut structure I talked about. Forget social mobility, it's ridiculous. You know, we don't want to just have the same, swap who the elites are. The elites used to be the landed gentry. Now they're the big corporates and people who are very clever. What's the point of that? You know, we've all got one life to live.
Okay.
So,
Thank you. If I can encourage Bill and Dave, we've got about a minute left for it.
Yeah, I'll be pretty quick
Sorry.
on this. In terms of the funding, a good question. I would hate to see £60 million of our money going into funding our political system. I think there's various ways we could tackle the kind of influence in terms of political parties. One, we could have a cap on how much money they could spend at election time, and secondly, we'd have there should be full transparency in who's donating this money. In terms of vested interests, you know, I can only talk for the Labour Party because I remember I pay 5p a week in my union, so it's the cleanest money in politics. And the lack of hope, I believe the lack of hope is because our politicians are not representative at all of the communities that they represent in life. You know, lots of them are from banks and financial institutions, legal professions is another. They're not normal people off council estates. They're not people who've grown up in an area and know all the you know, problems of getting your roof fixed if you live in a council house. You know, if they had done that, they'd know a little bit more about living. In terms of lack of accountability,
I am going to have to stop you because we've got a lecture theatre.
Sorry, Dave.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got 1 minute. I don't know that there is a lack of hope. Certainly there are activists who I sometimes associate with are extremely hopeful. They wouldn't be activists if they weren't. There are people working for social change. It's very hard. They recognise the need for it. I'm a member of the Green Party, which is probably gets even less money than the Liberal Democrats, I suspect. And yet it's full of hopeful people with new ideas, ways of restructuring, ways in which we can carry on without doing the same things we've done in the past. You need to. I think the answer to everything is education, always education. People need to understand the situation in which they live and the ways in which they can get out of the problems that they're in. That can only be through education. We need education, not training for jobs, which is what we're getting at the moment in universities. We need people to follow their aspirations and the ways in which they want to develop a society. That's my answer in 1 minute. Thank you.
Thanks for everybody for coming. If you did want to continue to talk to our guests, we can do outside, and there's another room just around the corner if that's required.